Welcome Beyond the Text by 6-7.
Hello.
Today we're plunging into a body of ancient religious knowledge that honestly fundamentally challenges how we even define the word God, let alone the origins of belief.
It really does.
We are dissecting the foundational texts of Shinto, a faith where a deity can be a raging storm, a cunning fox, a ceremonial sword, or, and this is my favorite, the mistress of the house.
Literally, yes.
We're going to track how early humanity conceived of divinity, moving from what some scholars call an unconscious agnostic state to a system where, well, moral ethics took a dramatic backseat to ritual purity.
A very, very distant backseat.
So prepare to explore a universe where the lines between the physical, the spiritual, and the authoritative were blurred by design. It reveals some deep insights into the structure of early religious thought, and I think forces us to question our own assumptions about the inevitability of monotheism.
This deep dive is really an anthropological study as much as it is a religious one. We're looking at sources like the Kojiki and Nihongi, and they give us this unique look at one of the earliest layers of human spirituality.
A spirituality centered not on some universal moral truth, but on immediate local efficacy.
Exactly. The system they created is, profoundly rational within its own context of nature worship, but it can feel profoundly strange to a modern audience.
And that's our mission today, to extract the core ideas of this nature worship, focusing on the breathtaking breadth of their deities, the kami, the evolution of their myths, and most critically, the structural absence of a moral code in the religion's purest, documented form.
We want to understand a civilization that built its entire spiritual foundation on ritual appeasement and physical cleansing, not on abstract righteousness.
So, before we can even begin to talk about the gods, we have to talk about the documents that recorded them. What are the sources that guide us to this period we're calling pure Shinto?
Well, the foundation really rests on a few key works compiled in the early 8th century. They were basically synthesizing centuries of oral tradition that came before.
Okay, so these are the first time these stories are really being written down in a formal way.
Precisely. And our two primary sources are the Kojiki, which translates to Records of Ancient Matters, finished in AD 712, and then the Nihongi, or Chronicles of Japan, which was completed just 8 years later in 720.
The Kojiki is the one that's usually cited as the oldest, right? And it reads more like a single flowing story.
It is, yeah. It has the most narrative drive, and the story behind it is fascinating. The Kojiki is famed for being dictated largely by a man named Hieda no R.
The man with a legendary memory.
That's the one. He was said to possess a photographic memory. He could recall absolutely anything placed before his eyes or ears.
Which, I mean, that fact alone tells you so much about the culture.
It speaks volumes. The reliance on an individual's perfect oral retention shows you just how much value was placed on tradition, and also maybe how fluid this information was before it was finally codified.
So it gives us this complete, flowing narrative of their creation myths.
Right. And then you have the Nihongi, which takes a, let's say, more scholarly approach, maybe even more political.
Well, it was compiled in Chinese, which was the language of scholarship and statecraft at the time.
Exactly. The Nihongi was an official state compilation. It was written using the Chinese language, which signals its importance and its intended audience. But what makes it so crucial for scholars today is that it explicitly includes numerous variants of the myths.
It prints them right alongside the main narrative.
It does, which is just incredible. So unlike so many other religious canons that try to enforce a single unified story, the Nihongi openly acknowledges that the mythology was, well, unsettled, that it was often contradictory.
That's the invaluable takeaway, isn't it? Those variants are proof that even in AD 720, the ancient mythology was still this fluid, dynamic thing. They were working with frequently irreconcilable material.
The compilers were clearly struggling to harmonize it all. You can see it on the page. They weren't trying to create a unified theology from scratch. They were trying to record an existing and, frankly, sprawling cosmology.
And then there's the Kujiki, which sounds like the wild card of the group.
It is absolutely the wild card. Native critics often condemn the region we have today as possibly being forged, but it's generally accepted provisionally because it seems to contain some very old source material.
And its defining characteristic is that it's just a mess.
It's clumsy. That's the perfect word for it. It makes zero attempt at synthesis. It just jumbles these distinct and openly conflicting narratives together. It's almost like a raw data dump of all the stories they had floating around.
So when we say pure Shinto, we're talking about the belief system we can piece together from these texts, plus a later ritual manual called the Yengishiki. And specifically, this is the Shinto before Buddhism arrived and permanently changed the spiritual landscape.
That distinction is absolutely vital. And ironically, the historical antagonism that grew between Shinto and Buddhism was actually beneficial for scholars today.
How so?
It acted as a kind of protective barrier. It prevented Shinto from being immediately or completely assimilated into this huge, powerful new religion. And because of that, we can trace and identify that original core nature worship belief system with much greater clarity.
Okay, so that brings us to the word that defines this entire universe of belief, kami. I think for anyone listening, trying to translate this with the Western word God just completely fails. How do we even begin to define kami?
You're right. God is a poor fit. Kami is the single most common and comprehensive term for a deity. Scholars connect its probable root to the word kaburu, which means to cover.
To cover.
Yes, and from that root we get its general meaning, above or superior. And this is the critical part. This idea of superiority is applied across the entire spectrum of existence, from abstract concepts all the way down to, literal household fixtures.
So we're not just talking about spiritual beings in the sky. We're talking about anything with exceptional power or rank or even just a powerful presence.
Exactly. The breadth is just astonishing. It, of course, covers the great nature gods like the sun, the wind, the moon. Thunder is a great example. It's specifically called Narukami, the sounding god.
The sounding god. I love that.
But then it extends into objects and natural phenomena that command awe, or maybe more importantly, fear.
Like mountains and seas.
Mountains, seas, the dragon, and even something as ethereal as the echo, which they personified as Kodama, or the tree spirit.
And you mentioned fear is a major criterion. That explains why certain animals get this divine status.
Yes. The fox is a kami specifically because of its uncanny, sort of fearful nature. The Nihongi also applies the title to powerful predators like the tiger and the wolf. The rule is simple. If it's awesome, or if it deserves gratitude, or if it inspires immediate dread, it's a kami.
Okay, now let's get to the human realm, because this is where the concept really challenges our expectations of a divine hierarchy. The mikados, the heads of state departments, nobles, they're all kami.
They are. They're deemed superior men, and because they share that characteristic of superiority, they share the title. But the real surprise for many people is the domestic application of the word.
Right.
The term okami-san is the honorific that's used for the mistress of a household.
So she is the domestic authority, elevated to a divine rank within her own sphere.
Absolutely. It shows you the immediate local nature of this belief system. Divinity is functional, it's hierarchical, even in the kitchen.
So the common thread isn't some kind of moral perfection or transcendence, it's purely rank, efficacy, or excellence.
And that insight leads us right to the anthropological explanation for this, most notably Herbert Spencer's theory. He linked this idea of height or superiority to rank and ceremony everywhere in human culture.
It's a practical observation. In a battle, you want the high ground. Being below is a position of weakness.
It's that literal. This physical relationship of superior and inferior becomes foundational for establishing rank in all human systems.
It's even baked into our language. The headman from Kaput. The head, the most vital part of the body.
And if you apply that same observation to the cosmos, well, what's the ultimate height? It's the glorious sky, what the Romans called hoc sublime candens.
The highest thing we can perceive.
Right. The fact that the most incomparably excellent, majestic, and glorious thing we know, the heavens, is also immeasurably the highest. That's why heavenly, or kami, comes to imply supreme excellence. This physical, observable prestige provides the authority for both the celestial gods and the mortal nobles and household heads who share the title. The concept is rooted in the physical observation of power, not some abstract theological decree.
And that distinction between observable power and abstract morality leads us perfectly into the origins of these deities. Scholars identified these two great currents of religious thought that lead to the creation of divinity.
They are very distinct processes, yes. The first current is personification. This is the primary basis for almost all of Shinto. It's the act of attributing sense and will to nature, which gives you nature gods.
And the second?
The second is deification. That's where you exalt preeminent qualities in human beings, which results in man gods.
So Shinto's immense pantheon begins primarily with man looking outwards at this powerful, chaotic universe and basically assigning intent to it.
It springs from that initial spontaneous reaction, gratitude for the sun or fear of a great storm. The primitive man observes these energies of nature, the relentless movement of the sun, the terrifying fury of the storm, and he makes this profound intellectual perception.
He concludes that there really goes something of the same kind that he is conscious of in himself, namely sense and will.
Exactly. The sun moves, it provides warmth, it disappears, and it returns. Therefore, it must be alive. It must have volition.
And that thought immediately triggers an emotion.
Awe, or dread, or gratitude. And that emotion results in an action. He bows his head, he makes an offering, and that's it. That is the entire framework of religion, born from 3 spontaneous, immediate steps: thought, emotion, and action.
This brings us to one of the most intellectually provocative concepts in the source material. The idea that the default state of humanity isn't spiritual, but actually agnostic.
This is such an essential counterpoint. The argument is that not every primitive man is a seer who makes that leap of personification. The source material argues that the ordinary, default human attitude is often profoundly agnostic. The primitive man is characterized as an unconscious agnostic, knowing nothing of volition in the inanimate world.
And the anecdote they use to illustrate this is perfect for modern discussions about atheism or non-belief. The Chinaman who sees the moon and just thinks it's all the same lamp pigeon.
A lamp pigeon, just a thing, an object, serving a function. It's not alive, it has no will.
What that implies is that the default setting for human consciousness, far from being innately spiritual or designed to seek a supreme being, is often just practical materialism.
Right. The impulse toward religion isn't inevitable. It's an intellectual leap that has to be made, based on interpreting observed power as conscious will.
And that truly challenges the argument you hear from some theologians, like Max Mueller, who said that belief in a supreme being is inevitable for mankind. Shinto, in its very structure, seems to prove the opposite.
It does. It suggests that localized, fragmented belief is the default, and grand monotheism is the exception, something that only emerges from a highly structured, abstract, intellectual process.
Shinto shows us a cosmology where hundreds, thousands of separate leaps, separate seer moments occurred as all these different unrelated natural phenomena were imbued with life and fear and will.
And once that leap is made, the process of personification accelerates very quickly, and that leads to what the source calls the anthropomorphic trap.
This is where things get complicated.
The stages often overlap in practice, but conceptually you can see a move from stage 1, which is the pure concept. The natural object is directly perceived as alive, so the sun is alive, to stage 2.
Stage 2 being anthropomorphism and metaphor.
Right. And here is where the problem starts, at least from a long-term perspective. The god, in stage 2, gets clothed in human myth and metaphor. He's given bodily parts, parents, a gender, human attributes. He eats, he fights, he marries, he even dies. He stops being an abstract force of nature and becomes a magnified man.
And the danger, as the sources really emphasize, is that the original nature divinity gets lost in the story.
It gets lost sight of completely. And the resulting magnified man, because he's a literal bodily representation drawn from our own flawed image, his ultimate fate is to be disavowed by advancing knowledge and enlightenment.
Once science can explain the sun god, the magnified man, becomes obsolete. He's just a character in a story, not a spiritual reality.
We see that transformation everywhere. Look at the Greek pantheon. Zeus started as a simple sky god, but he transformed into the father of gods and men, and his original function as a weather deity diminished.
Oh, in Japan.
In Japan, the average person who worships Susa no today has no idea they're worshiping the rainstorm god. Only scholars really retain that knowledge. And Tenshidejin, the great sun goddess, is increasingly just seen as the great providential deity of the Aa shrine. Her actual solar quality is practically forgotten by the people who rely on her for protection. The metaphor takes over, and the original natural force gets buried under the human mythology.
So, the structural consequence of all this localized, personified nature worship is just this inherent, massive polytheism. Shinto isn't just a religion with multiple gods, it's overwhelmingly polytheistic.
It's the completely logical outcome of the initial premise. If you don't have the scientific or theological framework to unify the universe under a single principle, what are you left with?
Imperfect and fragmentary glimpses of the vision splendid.
Exactly. Every significant natural power or social phenomenon demands its own conscious will, its own kami.
The sheer numbers are hard to even comprehend. The Yengi Shiki lists, 3,132 officially recognized shrines.
It does, but the number of deities is popularly spoken of as 80 myriads, or sometimes even 1,500 myriads.
Which is tens of millions of possible kami.
It's an effectively infinite number. And the pantheon is highly fluid because, and this is a critical point, most deities have no characters at all. They are placeholders for power. They aren't personalities.
Which leads to constant change. Gods are forgotten, or they get merged with other gods.
Or they're just named for their function. The god of the door, the god of the kitchen. This reinforces the idea that the worship is directed purely at the efficacy of the power, not the personality of the being. You're appeasing a force, not bonding with a singular moral entity.
The Japanese cared little about what god was there, only that a powerful one was there and needed respect.
There's that famous poem about the great shrine of Ise, which captures this perfectly. It says, "What it is that dwelleth here I know not, yet the tears trickle down."
The emotional and physical response to the sacred place is primary. The actual theological identification of the deity is almost irrelevant.
It's a powerful feeling disconnected from doctrine.
This inherent polytheism forces us to confront the failed quest for monotheism within Shinto. This is where the source material directly challenges these widely held notions about the inevitability of a supreme being.
It's a direct contradiction to that idea. Max Mueller's claim that belief in a supreme being is inevitable is explicitly shown to not be borne out by the facts of Shinto. Historically, several attempts were made to elevate a single deity to that status, but all of them were abortive or transient.
Who are the main candidates for supremacy?
Well, there were Kuni Tokatachi and Ame-no-mi Nakanushi, two of the earliest primordial gods. They were exalted at various points. Ohonamochi, the great landmaster, was another. But none of them ever maintained true dominance.
And Amaterasu, the sun goddess, she's the most famous.
She is certainly the most eminent Shinto deity, but she is not a supreme being. And the proof that she's not supreme is built right into the structure of her own myths.
Her authority is checked by a council of the gods.
Constantly. Her most famous act, hiding in the rock cave of heaven after her brother Susa nowhere offended her, is a perfect example. How is it resolved? Not by a higher divine lawgiver, but by the other gods staging a massive noisy party to trick her into coming out.
That's not the dynamic of an absolute monarch or a singular creator.
Not at all. It's the dynamic of a powerful but ultimately collaborative council.
But the truly bizarre anecdote that illustrates this human drive to find a single powerful entity, even if it's a blind search, is the everlasting world insect worship from AD 644.
Oh, this story is just incredible. It's such a stark example of a monotheistic movement devolving into the worship of a completely random, powerful object. A man named Oofub no Ohoshi urged his fellow villagers to worship a caterpillar.
A caterpillar.
A specific caterpillar, the Hosoki, proclaiming it the god of the everlasting world.
What did he promise his followers?
Long life and riches. If they just revered the specific entity, a grass-green caterpillar over 4 inches long that looked a bit like a silkworm. It was this desperate, if brief, movement to locate a single, all-powerful source of providence.
And it was so arbitrary and blind that it fastened onto an insect.
Which was, of course, very quickly crushed and banned by the court. But it shows you the search for supremacy without proving its inevitability.
Let's go back to Amaterasu for a moment, the sun goddess. The sources hint that there might be an older, masculine solar deity buried in the mythology?
They do. In the figure of Hiruko, the leech child, Hiruko was the firstborn of the creator pair Izanagi and Izanami.
And he was considered a failure.
A complete failure. After 3 years, he still couldn't stand up, so they deemed him a failure and sent him adrift in a little reed boat.
And his name, Hiruko, suggests a link to the sun.
A very strong one. Hiruko is the masculine form of Hirum, which means sun-female. This strongly indicates that he represents an obsolete, older male sun god who was basically discarded as the primary solar deity became female.
And this is a fantastic example of mythological recycling, because that cast-off failed god eventually becomes
Ibisu, the beloved god of good fortune, always depicted as a smiling fisherman. A failure in the cosmic creation story becomes the patron of commerce and daily luck.
We also have to talk about Amaterasu's volatile brother, Susanoo. He's often cited as the closest the early pantheon gets to a purely evil deity.
Susanoo is the arch-offender. He commits numerous celestial offenses, like breaking down the divisions of the rice fields, filling up irrigation ditches,
And most famously, flinging a flayed colt into his sister's sacred weaving hall.
Right. These are high crimes against the community and against ritual order. But he's not purely evil. He has his good points, and his core identity is still debated. Is he the rainstorm god? Or is he maybe the moon god, Tsukiyomi?
The debate centers on key myths, doesn't it? Particularly the slaying of the food goddess, Ukamochi.
Yes. In the Kojiki version, Susanoo is the perpetrator. He kills Ukamochi because he was deeply offended when she produced food for him from her various orifices.
A very visceral, almost disgusting image.
It is, and in the Nihongi version, that same violent act is attributed to the moon god, Tsukiyomi. But regardless of which deity commits the violence, the result is the same, and it's incredibly important to Shinto cosmology.
From the dead body of the food goddess, the essential seeds are born.
Silkworms from her eyebrows, rice from her belly, millet and beans from other parts. It's a violent, potent myth that establishes this necessary link between death, violence, and the natural cycle of agricultural sustenance. Life comes from a violent death.
Shinto's difficulty with abstract concepts leads us right into how the spiritual world was made concrete. We need to distinguish between the divine spirit, the god's body, and the material objects used in worship. So let's talk about kami, mitama, and shintai.
Okay, so we've established that kami is the overall term for a deity or superior being. Mitama is the spirit, or the divine spirit, which is often differentiated from the real body of the god.
And the shintai.
The shintai means god body, or sometimes it's called mitama shiro, the spirit token. This is the concrete physical object. It could be a mirror, a sword, a sacred stone, sometimes even a pillow, to which the divine spirit, the mitama, attaches itself.
So the shintai solves a very practical logistical problem for a widespread religion, doesn't it? If the sun goddess lives in heaven, how can she possibly attend to hundreds of local prayers simultaneously here on Earth?
That's precisely it. The shintai allows the mitama, which is a part of the god's essence, to reside locally and interact directly with worshippers. It's a very early, very physical attempt to reconcile the problem of divine distance with the necessity of divine presence.
The concrete object allows the celestial deity to be locally present.
Right. But this system, while incredibly convenient, introduces a major point of confusion for the average believer, and it leads directly toward what we would call idolatry.
The lines get blurred.
The source material is very clear on this. Scholars, like the great Shinto revivalist Motoori, had to distinguish very carefully between the real god and his mitama. But, as the text says, the unspiritual vulgar naturally find it hard to distinguish between the spirit of the god and its concrete representative.
Meaning that over time, the physical object becomes the god itself.
Exactly. The shintai becomes the object of worship, rather than just the vessel for the spirit it represents. For instance, the sacred mirror of the sun goddess, which is her shintai, is often worshipped separately by the common people under a different name, Amekakasu no Kami. The tool becomes the deity.
There's a perfect illustration of this principle of spiritual separation in the story of Okonomochi, the great landmaster.
Yes, that's a great example. Ohonomochi was struggling with the complexity of governing the land, and so he asked his own spirit, his tama, where it wished to dwell.
He has a conversation with his own spirit.
He does, and a divine radiance appears over the sea, and a floating entity announces, "I am thy spirit of good luck, the wonder spirit." And this spirit specifically requested to dwell on Mount Mimuro.
So the god's spirit explicitly leaves the god's body to reside in a specific location, which effectively generates a new, localized cult object.
It's the origin story of a shrine. It's a perfect example of this doctrine. The physical shrine and its shintai house, the mitama that's separated from the kami. Now, while scholars understood this complex chain of division, the average worshiper simply saw a powerful local entity that demanded appeasement at Mount Mimuro.
And this materialism extends to the conception of the human soul itself. The soul isn't seen as some abstract incorporeal essence, but as a physical thing.
The soul, the tama or kamashi, is fundamentally conceived of as material. You see this in folklore all the time. The will-o'-the-wisp is popularly called hitodama, which literally means man-ball soul.
A man-ball soul.
Yes. Furthermore, the soul of a newly deceased person is often imagined as a small, round, black object that can, even during life, leave the body during sleep.
Which aligns with a lot of lower culture beliefs globally, where an incorporeal soul is just conceptually too difficult to grasp. If it exists, it has to have some kind of material form, even if that form is ghostly or shifting.
Right. The Shinto texts confirm this idea that the soul is concrete enough to be seen, to be contained, and crucially, to contaminate.
So what about the afterlife? In a religion so focused on the material present, what awaits the dead?
Well, the ancient records give us few and uncertain glimpses of what happens after death.
The destination is Yomi.
Yomi, the land of darkness. It corresponds structurally to the Greek Hades or the Hebrew Sheol, also called Nenokuni, the root land, or Shitatsukuni, the lower land. And it's notable not as a place of moral punishment, but as a land of pollution and disease.
In fact, the physical embodiment of disease actually originates there.
It does. The 8 thunder gods, who are the personifications of disease and death, were generated there from the dead, putrefying body of the goddess Izanami. Death itself is the ultimate source of ritual pollution, and the afterlife is simply the place where that ultimate pollution resides.
And critically, the doctrine of the immortality of the soul is nowhere explicitly taught. Are there any prayers for the dead or for happiness in a future life?
Absolutely none. The focus remains entirely on this world, this life. The sources do show, however, that there were at least 2 opinions on the matter, as we see in the revenge tale of the warrior Tamichi.
Tell us about that.
After Tamichi died, his enemies dug up his tomb to desecrate his body. But a great serpent erupted from the grave, bit the desecrators, and poisoned them.
Which proves what?
The men of that time concluded, and I'm quoting here, "Although dead Tamichi at last had his revenge, how can it be said that the dead have no knowledge?" This is not a doctrine of eternal bliss or salvation. It's a fear of posthumous efficacy. The dead are still capable of acting in the world, and their power, now associated with pollution and danger, must be respected and feared.
We've established this lack of a moral element, but now we arrive at what might be the most astonishing structural difference between pure Shinto and most global monotheisms: the wholesale replacement of moral law with ritual regulation.
Shinto provides scarcely anything in the nature of a code of ethics. It is stunningly clear in the text that law, morality, and justice were thought to derive entirely from the Mikado's rule, from secular authority, not from divine religious sanction.
Which led to some pretty remarkable post-facto justifications by the Shinto scholars who tried to revive the religion later, like Motoori.
Oh, absolutely. Motoori famously claimed that moral codes and written laws were only required for those with inferior natures, like the Chinese, who required such artificial means of restraint.
The implicit claim being that the Japanese, being naturally upright, didn't need a divine moral law because they were just inherently righteous.
A proud and deeply ethnocentric claim, yes. But the undeniable proof of this moral vacuum is contained in the great purification ceremony, the Ohoharahi. If you really want to know what the gods cared about, you just have to look at what the people were being purified from.
The Ohoharahi was performed twice a year to absolve the entire nation of its offenses. And when you look at the schedule of offenses against the gods, the list is staggering for what it leaves out.
It contains none of the sins of the Decalogue. Murder, theft, adultery, they were entirely ignored by the religious text. This confirms they were seen as secular, political crimes, not divine ones. A problem for the Mikado, not the kami.
So if the gods aren't concerned with capital crimes, what is their primary concern?
The focus is overwhelmingly on pollution. Pollution is grouped under the term sumi, which we translate as guilt. But we have to understand that sumi comprises 3 distinct but linked concepts: uncleanness, some very specific and limited forms of sin or crime, and calamity.
And in that triumvirate, uncleanness is by far the most important.
It holds a far more important and pervasive place than moral guilt. It's not even close.
I have to pause on this. How could an otherwise functional agrarian society, a society concerned with order and survival, structurally decide that damaging an irrigation ditch is a divine offense, while an act of violent murder is just a problem for the local authorities?
The distinction lies in the concept of efficacy and the threat to the communal physical order. The kamis are concerned with maintaining the harmony of the natural world and the agricultural productivity that sustains the entire community. Murder and theft were social disruptions, handled by secular law.
But violations that directly threaten the essential agrarian order, the source of life itself, were seen as direct offenses against the powerful, often volatile nature gods.
Precisely. A breakdown of rice field divisions, filling irrigation ditches, sowing seed over again, these are categorized right alongside incest as high religious crimes.
Because they threaten the harvest. They risk famine. Therefore, they provoke the wrath of the kami.
That's it. So those are the only civil wrongs singled out for religious denunciation.
Let's detail the other ritual pollutions that dominate the concept of sumi.
They fall into distinct categories, all emphasizing physical perfection and the avoidance of corruption. First, you have physical pollution. Actual dirt required bathing before any rites. Things like baldness or emaciation were seen as physical imperfections that were offensive to the gods and could disqualify a priestess.
Then there's death and disease.
That's the big one. Contact with a corpse, leprosy, any form of severe sickness caused the ultimate uncleanness. The Shinto worldview was one of vital affirmation, so it actively sought to avoid everything associated with morbidity and decay.
And finally, social and sexual pollutions.
Yes. Sexual intercourse caused a temporary uncleanness that required ritual cleansing, and interference with the virgin priestesses was a crime that was severely punished.
The entire goal, therefore, isn't salvation from sin. It's the removal of physical and ritual impurity through the rite of harahi.
Harahi means purification, and the rituals were intense, designed to be functionally antiseptic and symbolically effective. They included washing, like body sprinkling, the extensive use of salt, which acted as both an antiseptic and a symbolic barrier against corruption.
And even spitting.
Even spitting, which was used as a mark of disgust and a physical means of purification.
And there was this profound system of ransom, or agamono, for getting rid of ritual guilt. It treats the impurity as a material substance that can actually be transferred.
That's the key idea behind agamano. Offerings were made to transfer the contamination, and the more intimately the objects were connected to the offender, the more effectual they were believed to be.
Like when Susanoo committed his celestial offenses.
He expiated them by the loss of his hair and his finger and toenails. Parts of his very body were the ransom.
And what did the supreme authority, the Mikado, do when he contracted some impurity?
In the purification ceremony for the Mikado, he would breathe on a suit of clothing. This was believed to transfer the entirety of his impurity onto the garment. That clothing would then be taken away and ritually thrown into a stream, carrying the contamination away from the person of the Mikado and from the nation itself. It's the ultimate expression of impurity as a transferable physical substance.
This focus on material efficacy and ritual transfer leads us to our next section, exploring the intermingling streams of myth, ritual, and pure magic. It seems like it's hard to tell what came first, the custom or the story that explains the custom.
The source analysis confirms that no general rule can be laid down. The relationship between myth and ritual is a constant chicken and egg problem.
For example, religious ablution, washing in the sea.
That is clearly a primitive hygiene and spiritual custom that is much older than the myth of the god Izanagi washing off the pollutions of Yomi. The practice preceded the divine justification.
But conversely, the worship of the sun is the source of the solar myths, not the other way around. The power existed first, and the story was built to explain the observed power.
Exactly. The ritual is sometimes the cause and sometimes the effect of the mythology. One of the most compelling areas where these two streams merge, alongside pure magical practice, is in the worship of the road gods, the Sahi no Kami.
These were the gods of the crossways, and they were often represented by phallic emblems.
The Sahi no Kami were simple phallic emblems set up everywhere by roadsides, specifically intended to prevent pestilence from entering Kyoto. And this highlights the dual significance of the phallus in early Shinto thought.
On one hand, it represents generative creation and fertility. But here, it's functioning as a pure magical appliance for protection and luck.
That dual nature is absolutely key. The third Sahi no Kami mentioned in the ritual texts, the Narito, was a god named Kunado, which was nothing but a simple phallus, supposedly formed from Izanagi's staff when he threw it down in disgust after escaping from Yomi.
These were massive objects.
Huge. Large wooden phalli, sometimes 7 or 8 feet in length, set up along highways specifically to prevent calamity. The worship was more akin to material magic than it was to theology.
And the color associated with them reinforces this magical potency.
The phalli were often colored bright red or gilt. Red, being a Yua male, bright, positive color, was seen as perfectly fitted to counteract the dark, negative, wintry influences that brought disease.
The power of red as a charm against smallpox and pestilence is seen globally.
It is, which reinforces its role here as a practical, almost non-religious protective charm.
Moving to pure magic, Shinto relied heavily on divination, or uranahi, which means revealing the unknown.
Divination was absolutely essential for decision-making across society. It was used for everything from selecting priestesses and predicting crops to deciding the Mikado's travel schedule or even finding a suitable husband. The methods ranged from the highly ritualistic to the almost folkloric.
Describe some of the more ritualistic methods.
The greater divination relied on using deer shoulder blades or tortoise shells. In the tortoise shell method, the candidates' names would be inscribed onto different shells, which were then roasted over a fire.
And the gods would decide.
The successful candidate's shell would remain intact and uninjured by the fire, while all the others would be reduced to ashes. It was a very dramatic, high-stakes way of letting the kami decide.
And what about the more common informal divination?
That would be Sujiura, or crossroads divination. It was very popular, particularly among lovers who were hoping to discover their future.
What did they do?
They would go to a crossroads at dusk, plant a stick in the ground to represent the road god Kunado, and then interpret the fragmentary first pieces of conversation they overheard from passersby as the answer to their question.
But the ultimate test of truth or innocence, going back to this concept of immediate efficacy, was the judicial ordeal.
The boiling water ordeal, or kugadachi. This was practiced to prove innocence or truthfulness when evidence was lacking. The accused would have to thrust their bare arm into boiling mud or be made to stir boiling water.
The faith in this material magic was so profound that they were willing to risk this.
The stakes were incredibly high. This process could and sometimes did result in death by severe scalding.
That is an immense commitment to the power of magic over rational judgment. The records even show one judge was criticized for being too reliant on the kukadachi, which led to many accidental deaths.
It illustrates that the power of the kami was not abstract law. It was immediate physical efficacy. If you were innocent, the divine power would protect your flesh from the scalding water. If you were guilty, you would be immediately punished. The gods were a court of immediate, if brutal, appeal.
As we start to conclude this deep dive, we have to acknowledge that pure Shinto, as this isolated religious form, eventually faded. The external pressure from Chinese culture was relentless.
The influence is profound and it's often subtle, but it's essential to understand. The foundational creator pair, Izanagi and Izanami, the personifications of the dual creative powers, are almost certainly inspired by the Chinese concepts of yin and yang, the female and male principles.
Even the writing system itself brought new ideas.
Yes, the early adoption of Chinese characters for the word kami often implied a more spiritual and abstract meaning than the native Japanese concept of mere superiority. The language itself pushed the ideas in a new direction.
And looking at the state of official Shinto today, scholars are generally unflinching in their assessment of its pure form.
While the religion was revived and refined by scholars like Motori and Harada into a codified pure Shinto, it's generally acknowledged as being structurally rudimentary. It's seen as inadequate for the spiritual sustenance of a nation which has raised itself to so high a pitch of enlightenment and civilization.
The mainstream of modern Japanese piety finds its necessary abstract morality and ethical framework elsewhere.
In Buddhism and Confucianism, systems that pure Shinto intrinsically lacked.
So what's the core deep dive insight here? What does ancient Shinto, with its focus on efficacy and its lack of universal morality, really teach us about the very nature of religious beliefs?
The insight is that ancient Shinto, in its purest form, was a comprehensive nature worship built entirely on three pillars: efficacy, fear, and gratitude. Not on moral rectitude or abstract theology. The distinction between the divine and the secular was deliberately blurred. Anyone or anything with manifest superiority was a kami.
They were seeking immediate protection and appeasement from the volatile, conscious forces of nature, a drought, a storm, a death, rather than seeking eternal salvation or adherence to a single abstract moral law.
And the failure to solidify a singular abstract moral god concept is Shinto's defining and I think its most informative feature. The religion evolved along the lines of recognizing local, immediate, and powerful volitions in the world. It treated mountains, storms, household mistresses, and mikados alike as demanding respect and appeasement based purely on their observed power.
It's a spiritual structure built on pragmatic observation, not divine revelation.
Exactly. A compelling, raw, and unfiltered look at how humanity first organized its relationship with a strange, powerful, and often terrifying world without ever settling on the idea of a singular moral creator.
So we spent this deep dive tracing how the ancient Japanese belief system, rooted in this idea of kami as anything superior, really reflects humanity's earliest, most pragmatic attempts to assign volition to the natural world.
Right, and this structure, which demands ritual purity from avoiding contact with corpses to not disturbing rice fields over moral adherence, it gives us this unique, almost archaeological view of a religion evolving almost exclusively along the lines of localized personification and the immediate fear of consequence.
It forces a profound intellectual challenge.
Yeah.
If we define religion by the worship of a singular, omnipotent moral entity, then Shinto fails that test.
It does. But if we define it as the structured human response to perceived non-human will, then Shinto is one of the most honest, unfiltered reflections of that initial spiritual impulse that we possess.
We've discussed Shinto's polytheism and the great difficulty of finding a singular, abstract creator, reinforced by that scholarly observation that the primitive man is an unconscious agnostic. So here's something to think about.
Go on.
If the core impulse of early religious thought was simply recognizing sense and will in the energies of nature, doesn't Shinto, with its deified storms, animals, and mundane household objects, provide a more honest reflection of that initial spiritual impulse than any highly evolved, codified theological system?
And what does that reveal about our own default setting for belief if we start from a position of lamp pigeon and only build divinity from observed superiority?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.